Hello, Dr. Dolly. My name is Kevin. I am a 45-year-old nurse anesthetist and very appreciative of everything that you're doing in finances for the medical community. I do have a question regarding index funds. I had purchased a Fidelity extended market fund as opposed to some of their other index funds that charge small expense ratios. And looking at the performance compared to their normal fund, there is a wide discrepancy. Maybe you can clue me in on the reasoning. The zero fund made 16.59% last year, 2020. Their regular expense ratio fund was 32.16%. The only thing I can see is the extended market zero fund did not have Tesla stock in it. I want to see if there's something else that you can see why there would be such a wide discrepancy. And it makes no sense, apparently, to buy the zero fund when you're going to lose half your money on return. Just looking to see what you think about it. Thank you.
That's a great question. For those who don't know what he's talking about, Fidelity actually has kind of two sets of index funds. A couple of years ago, they came out with these new zero index funds. I think there's 3 or 4 of them, but basically, there's 4 of them. Basically, they decided they were going to take this race to the bottom as far as expense ratios go to the maximum, right? Vanguard's been lowering their expense ratios over years, and Fidelity and Schwab's and iShares have been trying to keep up with them. And they often, kind of make them a loss leader even and charge 1 basis point less than Vanguard does, for instance, for those who think 1 basis point of expense ratio matters, which it doesn't, of course. But they basically took it to an extreme and started not charging an expense ratio at all on these 4 new funds they came up with. But when they came up with those, they didn't lower the expense ratio on the index funds they already had. They started new funds. And they are a zero large cap index fund, a zero total market index fund, a zero extended market index fund, and a zero international index fund. Now, they already had index funds that basically followed similar segments of the market, but these were new ones that they added in. And I think it's worthwhile talking about that concept for a minute. I wrote a post at the time, this was back in 2018. I titled it, "Don't Obsess about Expense Ratios." And what I meant by that is that once you get down below about 10 basis points, the expense ratio is not the most important aspect of choosing a fund. When you're looking at index funds, you care about a couple of things. The first one is what index does it follow? And the second one is how well does it follow that index? And the expense ratio plays into the second part of that. But it has nothing to do with the first part, which is what index does the fund follow? What is it trying to track? And obviously you want them to be good at running an index fund. That's one of the reasons why I wouldn't necessarily bail out of Vanguard to Schwab or Fidelity, because I think Vanguard's better at indexing than those other companies are. Even if the expense ratio is a basis point or 2 higher, in general, if you look at the long-term performance, it's equal to or better than what you'll get at Fidelity and Schwab. And I think that's just because Vanguard's better at indexing, number one. And number two, when they loan out their shares to short sellers, like people that want to short sell GameStop and American Airlines and BlackBerry and those kinds of stocks, they get income from lending those out. And Vanguard passes more of that income along to you than Fidelity does. So that's part of the reason that Vanguard does such a good job following the indices. But the first part of that is, what index does it follow? And the answer to your question of why one of these funds did so much better than the other fund comes down to the index it is following. Both of them did a fine job of following the index they were trying to follow. But despite both of them being extended market index funds, meaning the entire US market minus the stocks in the S&P 500, they follow different indices. The first one, the one that charges an expense ratio, is FSMAX. This is the Fidelity Extended Market Index Fund. And if you look at its Morningstar X-ray box, which I've talked about a lot on the blog, I don't know how much I've talked about it on the podcast, but if you go to Morningstar and look up a fund and look in its portfolio, it'll show you an X-ray box, which tells you where the fund sits on the scale between large cap and small cap and on the scale between value and growth. And you can see, if you look at that fund, that it's centered. The center of this fund is basically in the mid-cap growth segment. Now, if you look up the same information on the Fidelity Zero Extended Market Index Fund, you will see that it centers in the upper right-hand corner of the small cap blend segment of the market. Clearly, these two funds hold different stocks. It's not just Tesla, it's a bunch of different stocks. The one that charges an expense ratio is growthier and larger on average than the one that doesn't charge an expense ratio, which is smaller and more value-y. So you shouldn't be surprised in a year in which large and growth stocks perform very well, like 2020, that the fund that is larger and growthier is going to have better returns. And that's exactly what happened last year. Large growth outperformed. The fund that was larger and growthier had higher returns, and indeed it did. The first thing I checked when you left this question was I made sure you were actually accurate, and you were accurate. It turns out that the performance on each of these funds, I think it was on the one that charges an expense ratio, FSMAX, I think it was 35%. In 2020. So it was a really good year for them. 32.16%, sorry. And on the Zero Extended Market Fund, it was not that. It was actually 16.59%, so significantly less. Why was it less? Not nearly as much large growth in it. Turned out owning Tesla in 2020 was really good for your mutual fund. If you want your questions answered by the White Coat Investor, record your question at whitecoatinvestor.com/YQA. or click the link in the description.